Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Today joined by my co-host, that's Alexis. How are you doing today, Alexis?
Good to be back.
Thanks for listening to
It has
A
been a
Fork
while.
in
It's been a
Time,
while since the two of
the
us have
alternate
actually
history
done an episode
podcast.
together. You've
Join
done a
us
couple of
next
solo
time.
episodes. I've done as well, and we've had some guest hosts. So today we're back doing a joint episode. And guess what? Since Alexis is on the podcast, if you're a betting listener to the podcast and know what's coming, what part of the world might we be visiting today, Alexis?
Oh, you know, the UK.
The UK. Britain, as it was called back then.
Not even Britain. We're going back to England.
Oh, wow. Okay. I stand corrected. Don't mess around with history of the British Isles when you have an expert in the room. That's the moral of the story for me. We actually are going to go back in time. We're going back, actually, as we've discussed, we're going back to an event that is similar to something that we've covered in a past episode. So initially, listeners may think that it sort of is the same fork in time, but if you really think it through, it's not the same fork in time. One of our early episodes focused on what would have happened if Arthur, who was what became Henry VIII's older brother, had lived to become king. We're going to talk again in the same genre, again getting a male heir.
Yes.
For Henry VIII. We're going to talk about that here in a minute, but it's slightly different in the sense that we're going to look at a historical what if that's not centered directly around Arthur, but is centered around Henry VIII. And what are we going to center on there, Alexis?
We are going to center on his first son, actually also named Henry after his father. So a lot of these same characters, you're going to be like, wait, am I listening to a previous episode? And you're not. But we're going to be centering around his son, Henry VIII's son, also named Henry, the Duke of Cornwall.
Okay, so this is the historical what if instead of the real timeline of history, Henry becomes king, does not have a male heir. We know that he goes through not just one, not just two, but count them, 6 wives.
So much so that they made a coffee mug with them on it,
yeah.
which I own. It's a thing.
Yeah, but through 6 wives in an attempt to have a male heir that lives. And so what we're going to talk about here is if his firstborn son, again, between Henry and Catherine of Aragon, had lived. So sort of our what if today is what if there had actually been a Henry the Ninth.
Correct.
Is where we're going to go. And we're going to talk about how that would have impacted history. Not so much from the perspective of what Henry the Ninth might have done, but how things would have been different under the reign of Henry VIII.
Right.
So just to place the historical marker here, and again to distinguish it from our No Round Tables episode, where we focused on what would have happened if Henry's older brother Arthur had become king. Thus, there is no Henry VIII. We're going to focus on Henry does become king. Arthur still dies. He does marry Catherine, but their first child, Henry, which we're going to talk about here as you give a little of the background on who Henry was when he was born and all of that, if he had lived and how that would have changed, most of our focus will actually be on Henry VIII's reign,
correct.
because he has a surviving male heir, maybe, as we talked about earlier, an heir and perhaps even a spare that comes along as well. So in the real timeline, Alexis, there was a child named Henry that was born. So tell us a little bit about that birth.
Yeah, so Henry VIII's son Henry, to delineate a little bit, was actually born on January 1st of 1511. Who was a New Year's baby. And you'll note he was born fairly quickly after his parents got married. Henry VIII becomes king in 1509. So already in January of 1511, we've got a baby coming. You can do some math on that and determine how quickly Catherine was able to get pregnant. But that child, in the real time of history, unfortunately doesn't live very long. He only lives for around 52 days. Reports kind of vary a little bit on what his actual date of death is. The one that I particularly like to go with for personal reasons is that he passes away on February 22nd of 1511. The reason I go with that date, it's my birthday, so it's easy to remember. But as you can see, that is not a very long life between January 1st and February 22nd. So very, very short life there for Henry, who was immediately ennobled with the title Duke of Cornwall. The assumption was that he would eventually become Prince of Wales, obviously heir apparent, but that does not happen in the real timeline.
Okay, so what does happen from that point on in the real timeline, just to set the stage so that we can look at the alternate timeline, is Henry and Catherine do try, again, they have other children, right?
They have other children, I think up to 6. I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but quite a few that are either stillborn or that are born and die fairly quickly, even before the 52-day mark. They die within hours. And they do have one daughter that does actually live, becomes an heir to Henry VIII, actually becomes queen. That's Mary, who's born in 1516, who we will get to a little bit later. So they do have kids. Henry is kind of the mind when this happens, Catherine and I are both young. I still love my wife very much. Let's keep trying. But as we'll see as we kind of go through the actual timeline and kind of take our fork and go through with the alternate timeline, Henry ultimately decides, okay, Catherine's not doing what I need her to do. Time to find wife number 2.
Right.
So
in the normal course of history, again, Henry never has a male heir. After he does eventually seek to divorce Catherine, but then breaks with the Catholic Church to be able to get that divorce actually performed, actually an annulment, not just divorce, but an annulment, so that he can marry again and thus seek a male heir to the throne. So that's the real timeline of history. We're pretty familiar with that, so we won't spend a whole lot more time talking about that. Henry's a pretty well-known figure throughout history as well. So in our alternate timeline, again, the assumption that we're making, the break in time, is that young Prince Hal, in a couple of my pieces of research, I saw him referred to as Prince Hal. The eventual theoretical Henry IX lives beyond the 2-month period of time, and so what we have is during Henry VIII's reign is there's no need to seek a dissolution of his current marriage and all of the things that flow from that.
correct.
So again, starting as a particular point to begin to understand the departure a little bit, what was Henry's position before the death of his son and before seeking the annulment to get a second marriage? What was his position with respect to the Catholic Church?
He was a very, 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 I cannot stress that enough, staunch Catholic. He actually is granted the title Defender of the Faith, or Fide Defensor, by the Pope because he actually does some writings against Martin Luther. He's like, no. The Pope is the head of the church. We are devoutly Catholic. So, he is very, 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 very much aligned with Rome in his reign.
And you mentioned there that some of the writings are actually, and he wrote, where some of the writings were against Luther, one of the leaders of the Reformation. So the backdrop here, I think most probably who listen to our podcast have a little bit more of affinity for history than most. But the backdrop here is there is a movement that's afoot in all of Europe to some degree, but particularly in Germany and parts of Northern Europe, that's looking to reform the Catholic Church, what we call the Reformation. At the time that Henry is King of England, England will eventually become a Protestant nation in the real timeline.
Yes.
But at the time that Henry assumes the throne, they are not a Protestant nation, even though they have forces, and there are some inside of England who are sympathetic to the Reformation and have their own ideas about Reformation within the church. England is not a Protestant country.
Correct. There were definitely people who had those leanings, were sympathetic to that cause. There were even people in the court who were sympathetic to that cause. But England itself as a nation was a very Catholic nation.
Okay, and of course, Henry's bride, his wife, Catherine, the Queen, comes from Spain and is also a very, very, very devout.
Very devout Catholic. Spain is a very devoutly Catholic nation, so it only makes sense that these two figures are very, very attached to the Catholic Church.
And some of the research and some of the reading that I was doing here, later when Henry writes one of his treaties defending the faith, he provides some dedication to, sort of almost not really dedicating to Catherine, but dedicating to the fact that he believed Some of the blessings that had come upon him were the result of his union with Catherine, and again being very loyal to the Orthodox faith as it was thought of at that time, not necessarily the Reformation that were being proposed by Luther and others who were looking to change the church. And I guess it's a fair thing to say aside here. We use the term Protestant now, looking back on it. The correct term was Reformation. Luther was not looking to
break.
He was not looking to break from the Catholic Church originally. He was looking to reform the Catholic Church. It's only later, over a period of time, that there ends up being a break between Catholicism and the various Protestant movements and Protestant denominations that rise out of the Reformation. So, again, looking at the alternate timeline here, we have Henry, King of England, with an heir, allied fairly closely with Spain as a result of the marriage between Catherine and himself. And so they're very much part of what would have been, from the political aspect of this religious disagreement, very much they're aligned politically with the Catholic countries and the nations that were supporting the Catholic cause.
Very much so.
And so what that leads us to is, if he's still in that role, and there's the alignment that exists there, what impact would that have had? In other words, how would have history been different for the Reformation in general?
I think definitely there wouldn't have been as much of a galvanization of the Reformation, just because there would kind of be the northern nations of Europe, Germany, Holland, places like that would kind of be isolated, because if you think about the powerhouses of Europe, people like Spain, France, England, if all of those nations are allied and they're Catholic, these other nations that are Protestant can't really get their modes of thinking off the ground and kind of get this fire that stokes and kind of sweeps through Europe in the way that it does. Definitely. You'd also have this issue of Henry would probably think, hey, I've got the backing of these two strong Catholic nations. Let's go invade these places. Let's take them over and let's turn them around to what we think is our right way of thinking. So it's possible we might have seen wars in Holland, wars in Germany, with the forces of Spain and England and France united together as a Catholic cause.
Yeah, I think that is one possibility, and to me one of the strongest differences in a timeline where there's no split with Henry and the Church, simply because it had certainly been the case that England was more than willing to dabble in European affairs, particularly in those areas of France. The disputes that existed had gone back there for hundreds of years over some of the territory there in Normandy and all the other things. The connections between the rulers of England actually having come from the continent, from being descended from the Normans.
Correct.
And some of the ways that those hereditary things worked through. And then we see even later, during the real timeline, when Spain and England are in conflict with each other. For example, there are conflicts in what we think of as modern-day Holland, in the area near Belgium, the northern coast of Europe, where there are British forces that are opposing Spanish forces in those territories. So that actually happened in the real timeline, just for a different reason. So
right. I
think it is a fair thing to assume that an emboldened Henry, backed by the papacy, backed by other continental allies, could have easily one of the ways to take on the cause of the Reformation and, if you will, set them right, was by not just by writing treaties, but by actually trying to enforce, by taking over land and sort of forcing the Reformation to go underground.
Right. You had the same thing in the Crusades. These people who were, European powers that were like, hey, we're going to go over here and we're going to make it right. So I don't think it's a far assumption to say that things like that would have happened.
Now, I mentioned earlier that there had been the long-standing sort of disagreement and conflict that existed at various points between England and France. So one of the things that jumps to my mind is another possible way that would extend out is Spain and England, very close allies because of the marriage and the other things that have taken place there. Perhaps in addition to Henry becoming involved in matters continental on behalf of the church, may have been given a little bit more reason to feel some boldness in terms of pressing the conflict the ongoing conflicts with the French and some of the disputes that had long existed for centuries before, because he doesn't have to worry about Spain as an enemy. He has Spain as a friend. France had been both friend and enemy. They're sort of a frenemy for a long period.
Depending on the day.
Yeah, and depending on what's going on there. So do you think it's possible that one of the other possible changes to the political map of Europe would have been England and France, and how things would have played out with England having Spain and the church as an ally?
I think that could go one of two ways, actually. I think England could, again, feel emboldened with the backing of Spain to be like, I want to go to war with my frenemy. I'm going to make him an enemy right now. Or, I think possibly, if we're going along with this assumption that Henry the Duke of Cornwall lives, he's going to need a wife at some point. There's a lot of princesses hanging out in the court of France, in the Valois court. So, there's possible that Henry's looking and saying, hey, I've got a great marriage alliance with Spain through my wife. Let me build a great marriage alliance with France through my son. So I think there's two possibilities there. Either he can ally with Spain to attack France, or he can say, let me build what I've got with Spain with France.
Okay. So we've covered there the potential impact, at least in a broad sense, on the Reformation in general. And then also politically how things may have worked different as a result of maybe Henry being more willing to engage in conflict and wars and politics on behalf of the church, and then also separate from the church. Now, we did mention earlier that there is something of a Reformation movement to some degree that does exist inside of England. England was not immune
right.
To the cause of Reformation and the idea that there need to be changes within the church. So what type of Reformation forces existed in England at the time that Henry is assuming the throne, sort of at the start of his rule, about the time that the presumptive Henry IX would have been born?
You have people who are very much in that mode of thinking, in that Reformation mode of thinking, and in that line of thought, but they're being very quiet about it. So I think it's not unfair to say that if Henry is kind of emboldened in that approach to Catholicism, those people might have been quieted. Those people might have immigrated to those other countries, much like the Pilgrims immigrated later on in the real timeline to get away from religious persecution. I think you might have seen this fleeing of these great courtiers and these people who were doing great things in England, like, this place isn't safe for me, I'm going somewhere that is. And that might affect the legal system in England. That might affect Parliament. That might affect multiple things in the court of Henry VIII.
So, is it a fair thing to say that in the real timeline, as England becomes Protestant for the reasons they become, not to say that England would not have had the point I'm trying to make is that England did have Protestant efforts that were going on. Eventually, those efforts become supported to a degree because of Henry breaking with the church and usurping those as now as a basis of support versus something that he would have been opposing. So it's not that England didn't have Protestantism, but I guess the question is, and you just mentioned this, what form would Protestantism have taken in England if it were not welcome to have an atmosphere that it could grow in, which it did in the real timeline very quickly, because Henry needed those folks to support what he wanted to do. And so, as you point out, there's two ways that might have gone. I guess there are actually three. I think the least likely of those three is actually that there would have been some form of English civil war or conflict in the country, because for the most part, what my understanding of history is that the forces for Reformation inside of England, while they existed, were not strong and they were not widespread.
Right.
The average Englishman on the streets or on the farm was happy to remain Catholic, just as long as there was peace and prosperity and everything that was going there. There was not a fervency among the majority of the English population.
Right.
And so it's unlikely that you would have seen, at least at that point in time, some form of revolution or active attempt to overthrow Henry or his heir in favor of a Protestant monarch. Later it does become a point of contention between Catholics and Protestants for the English throne. That's English history for the next couple of hundred years, give or take. But instead, it would be one of the two things. Either you have the situation where it just becomes quieted, so it's there, but it's an underground type of situation, or as you say, that maybe is a cause for folks to migrate away, which then makes England even more Catholic because it doesn't have the other influences.
Right.
And so you mentioned he's already been given the title Defender of the Faith. They then become not only one of the strongest defenders of the Catholic Church, but also even more so Catholic just because those who would oppose that leave.
Yeah, they get the heck out of Dodge.
Yeah. And so the result of that is there is no English version of the Protestant Reformation as we know from real history. Which, when you think about, one of the most incredible things in terms of modern impact of that is the 1611 authorized version, what we sometimes call the King James Version of the Bible in English. The Catholic Church was not inclined prior to further down the road to translating the Bible out of Latin. And so the very existence of what most people think of as being, if you're in the English-speaking world, the Bible for hundreds of years, probably doesn't come into being because that very much was the result of Reformation and Protestant activities that were going on to move the Bible into the common language of the people. That was a Reformation thing, usurped to some degree later by the Catholic Counter-Reformation in a different way. But imagine, if you will, there's no, or at least there's a delayed version, and we certainly don't probably call it the King James Version. There's no Bible in English for a longer period of time because there's no Protestant hold inside of England to even cause that into being. That's just one of those things, a book you have on the shelf or a book you may use on a regular basis either doesn't exist or is delayed in its existence or comes into being a different way. Maybe there's a translation of the Bible that is an English translation that is very Catholic as things move forward from there. So continuing the theme of the change in religion, we mentioned the possibility of English church reformers perhaps fleeing to safer havens on the continent. I guess the other possibility would be that they would maybe choose to flee to something further away, safer away, which they may choose to flee to the New World.
Possibly. It's very, very possible. There might have been a kind of co-colonization, if you will, of the New World between Spain and England, and those people who were having problems with the way the religion was going and had different thoughts in England might have went, instead of going to Europe, let's go that way. Let's go towards America and see if that's a better place for us to share our ideals and live our lives.
Of course, in the real timeline, that did happen. It just happened much later. It happened sometimes with the permission of the crown, sort of sometimes without. But the crown was willing to look the English crown was willing to look the other way because Spain did have so much territory in the New World, and Spain was the enemy. In fact, on the high seas and in colonial territories, England and Spain in the real timeline are not friends.
No.
Francis Drake, when he's pillaging and pirating, he's attacking primarily
Spanish galleons.
Spanish galleons laden with gold. And so there you have a sense of conflict. You mentioned, the potentials. We were talking off mic, the possibility there may have been some form of joint exploration or at least an agreement about how the exploration would happen after we assume still the Spanish discovery of the New World with Columbus, because that does happen before the changes in timeline that we're talking about here. But that there may have been more cooperation among the allies of Spain and England. And the thing that jumps to my mind is eventually the Catholic Church makes a decision, the Pope makes a decree, it's a papal bull, that divides the New World between Spain and Portugal. Mm-hmm. You could easily imagine a different version of a papal bull because of what's going on in this new timeline that's dividing the world between Spain and England.
That is not a far leap to make at all.
Right. And so, again, the map of Europe may look different, as we've talked about earlier, with a change in how the Reformation and then whatever counter-Reformation might have taken place with England now on the side of the counter-Reformation, not on the side of the Reformation, but also could have had a drastic shaping of the New World, where Spain primarily had Central and South America, and England, of course, settled in the eastern coast of North America, along with French interests. You certainly could have a situation where there may have been more English possessions that were further south, or it's hard to know exactly how that would have been different.
That were further north.
Right. It's hard to know how that would have broken up, but you would have had a different set of circumstances that would have occurred and would have been in existence during, what we typically think of as being the age of exploration, the age of discovery, and then the age of colonization, and seeing how that would have played forward as we move over time. So again, ultimately in the real timeline, one of the major influences in terms of the colonies, the English colonies that would eventually become the United States of America, flows a great deal from a religious heritage of fleeing persecution and looking for religious freedom and religious tolerance. We still may have seen that, just may have come earlier, may have come in a different form, and you certainly wouldn't have had places that were named in the American colonies, Virginia or maybe Maryland or some of the other things that were there, because those took the names from the various English monarchs that came as a result of the actual timeline, not the theoretical timeline that we're talking about here.
Right, this thing called Jamestown.
Yeah, exactly. And well, for example, there may have never been a need, which of course is what leads to the King James Bible. We talked about this before on the episode where we talked about No Round Tables. The different related but still a different scenario of Arthur, Henry's older brother, living, is there may have never been a need for James VI of Scotland to become James I of England, and the things that are going on with that. I guess that does raise an interesting question, because eventually, what is the role of Scotland in the Protestant Reformation? What are they primarily at the time of Henry's taking the throne?
They are Calvinist, so they are Protestant. And they are literally right on Henry's front door, being on the same island. So he's, again, if he's got that backing of Spain and of France, because he's this great powerhouse Catholic ruler, it is, again, not a far leap at all to be like, okay, yeah, I'm technically related to the people up there, but they're not in my line of thinking. Let's go up there and let's subjugate them.
Yeah, and so we were talking earlier about Henry meddling more in the affairs of other nations on the continent because of being an ally of the Counter-Reformation or an allied against the Reformation. I guess it's even hard to know if there would have been a need for a Counter-Reformation if there was a less successful Reformation in the first place. Exactly. But under that scenario, you may have seen the very first place that Henry may have turned, as you point out, would have been more towards getting the house in order, so to speak, in Scotland, before turning to and then looking at what he might do on the continent, even though the vast majority of, for example, the Lutheran Reformation experience was happening more on the continent. But you're right. John Calvin and Zwingli and some of the others that were also part of the Reformation. We often think of Luther when we think of the Reformation. He was not the only leader of the Reformation. No. He was just one of them. You may have seen more of a change to what was going on in Scotland, or the situation that was there. So that produces, again, potential changes on the period of time that we think of being exploration and colonization, and maybe changes the motivations behind that. But then also, again, extends back to the idea of what may have happened closer to home because of what's happening there. I guess a third possibility, it's hard to know, but you may have had a Henry sanctioning. Okay, if you're not going to agree with the faith as we've established it here, you are free to leave, but you must leave.
Right.
And so you might have, I don't guess it's properly the exact way to think about it, but I think about eventually the formation of Australia as part of the Commonwealth. It was not exactly ideal folks that they sent there, essentially a prison colony, or
right.
the emphasis of that. So there may have been a different, you can be English and you can hold to a slightly different form of belief, but you're not going to do it here on the islands.
Yeah, you get to live over there.
You get to live over there. And by the way, you'll still be subject to us, but we want you over there to keep it further away, to keep it an ocean away. So I can certainly see that happening as well. So are there any other primary impacts, maybe not on England, but the rest of Europe? You mentioned potential marriage alliances. Do you think it changes the fortunes dramatically of Spain or of other, if you will, Catholic powers that rise as a result of the Reformation, or does that pretty much stay the same?
I think it pretty much stays the same in terms of the balance of that. I think there might have been a different distribution, but I think the distribution would probably end up being about what it was.
Yeah, one of the things that I question there, and I don't know if I have a firm opinion on this, but I think it would have been different, is ultimately Spain becomes the predominant power in Europe that is defending the faith, is defending traditional Catholicism, and ultimately becomes the predominant power in Europe during the Counter-Reformation. Hence, we have the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, there was an English. There were other Inquisitions. There was an English Inquisition as well. But when you think about it, there, Spain rises out of the religious conflict as a more predominant nation because they are the largest nation by far that stays true to the traditional Catholic faith. France is divided and goes back and forth in a number of different ways, even though there'll still be a large Catholic influence in France historically. Later, the Huguenots served that role. But it's interesting in my mind to think through: could England have become that preeminent nation state that is Catholic? Would it have been shared with Spain? Or I guess the ultimate possibility that exists there is, yes, for a couple of hundred years there's cooperation, but eventually those are now the two powers inside of a much more religiously united Europe that eventually come to heads over who's going to be in charge, who's going to be the big dog on the block when it comes to being inside of inside the Catholic Church. So you might have still seen eventually conflict between England and Spain, but not over a difference of religion, but over who was going to be in the predominant role inside of the more traditional Catholic theology.
And of course, I think it's important to remember that even though there's a marriage alliance with Spain and with England, that doesn't mean we're going to be friends forever. You've seen that in European history before. Just because two people get married, hundreds of years later, it's like, yeah, we're technically related, but that doesn't mean I'm your friend right now.
Right. So
I think it's not a far assumption to, if you have this power vacuum where eventually England and Spain are the big dogs, you have kind of these two aggressors going at each other and trying to figure out who's going to be the bigger one. So I think that's definitely a possibility.
I think certainly the other possibility, which I do have more conviction about that's a potential change, is much of what we think of as being Western democracy, moving away from monarchy, even into constitutional monarchy, is the result of what happens in England after the Reformation forces take hold. You have the period of time when there is no monarchy. You have a period of time, during the age when Oliver Cromwell comes to power, and the other things that happen there. But a great deal of what we think of as being the ideas that eventually become English democracy, that translate into being American democracy, a moving away from divine right of kings to more of a constitutional monarchy, or even just a constitution without a monarchy in the case of America. That's the result of this unique combination of what is English and also what is not Catholic in the in traditional sense there. Not to say there wouldn't have eventually have been, not to say that Catholicism is incompatible with democracy. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is the incubator that democracy grew inside of was an incubator that was tied to the idea of what was going on with Protestant movement and the Reformation, and plays into that in such a way that you probably would have seen a very different political structure in England. The monarchy would have gone on much further. Now, what ultimately may happen there is there may be other forces, economic, etc., that come along that challenge that produce a revolution in England. It's not a religious revolution. It becomes to be an economic revolution because you don't have the revolution that comes before it, which is tied with being a religious revolution, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going a long way to say that the idea that we have of, if you will, 21st century democracy flows from the things that are happening here. It takes a while for that to happen. There's a couple of different steps and jumps and turns that it takes along the way, but eventually it leads to something that empowers the people more than empowers nobility or empowers the church.
Those thought leaders that ultimately are the founding fathers of what we think as modern day democracy, came out of this very, very religiously charged backdrop.
Right.
And so it's interesting to think how writings of people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, those people that are the forefathers of modern democracy, how would those writings and those thoughts have been different if they weren't coming out of this religious melting pot of idea?
Right. For example, even you think about how American democracy comes to be. It comes out of, for example, congregationalism as being one of the things that this idea that the church is not as hierarchical in its structure, and thus government is not as hierarchical in its structure. When you think about the ideas that Luther and others were purporting in terms of not having the same role of the clergy and the power of the church being a hierarchical institution, again, those are the seeds that are planted that eventually grow to being various forms of what we think of in the modern sense as being democracy. They didn't necessarily look that way very early on, but those are where those come from, particularly, as I mentioned, the congregational model. This idea of
everyone's equal.
Yeah, and we're not looking to a king, we're not looking to a pope, but we're looking to our local elected, chosen, selected leaders to be our leaders here. That's very much a democratic ideal that flows out of the Reformation. So religion affecting politics, politics affecting religion there, without and a lot of that being English, in terms of how it comes along. So if there's a delayed period of time, even if it's only through the reign of Henry IX, and who knows what would have happened then, with whether something similar would have happened with, we may be talking about Henry IX and his 5 wives or his 7 wives or whatever the case might be, instead of Henry VIII. But if that flows along, then we might be in a situation where it still ultimately happens, but the initial things that start leading more promptly towards what we think of as being democracy in the middle of this backdrop are certainly there. So as we draw things to a close, one of the other things we were actually talking about off mic was assuming that, let's talk about the assumption. So Catherine's his first wife. Henry, I'm going to call him Henry IX just because it's easier for me, lives and ultimately will ultimately become king. But what would have happened if it was not uncommon in childbirth or in some other means for someone to die, particularly in childbirth? So let's say Catherine then dies in a subsequent childbirth, and so the presumed Henry IX is alive, but the question we were talking about was, does Henry VIII then remarry, not with now needing the sanction of the church because of a divorce or an annulment, but just to remarry, to marry again and have subsequent heirs? And your suggestion was?
I have a couple thoughts on this. One thing I would think, it is important to note in the real timeline of history, he does marry 6 times. But if you look at the time of those marriages, he is married to Catherine for as long, or if not longer, than he is married to his other 5 wives put together. His other 5 wives are, for lack of a better term, means to an end. They're a way to get an heir, because he's constantly in this mode of, I need my heir, I need my heir, I need my heir. If he has his heir as the future Henry IX, and Catherine unfortunately passes away, I think it's not unlikely to think he decides, Catherine was my one love, I'm safe, I've got my heir, I'm not marrying again. I'm not putting myself through that again. I'm not going to essentially be brokenhearted by the death of another wife. Because as you pointed out, death is very common, either in childbirth, particularly at that time for women, or just common disease. You had, the flu, you had the sweating sickness, you had smallpox, you had so many things that could take a life, and could take a life very young, that I think it's not a far cry to say, Catherine died, but I've got my son, I'm done. It also could be a possibility that he said, okay, I'm going to try one more time and I'm going to marry somebody. Would he have married Anne Boleyn? Don't know. Anne Boleyn would have been much older because Catherine would have lived much longer and had her son. So we wouldn't have had Elizabeth I. It's important to think about. The people that we think of when we associate with English history kind of all come out of this constant need of Henry VIII to keep marrying and try to get that elusive son. You have people like Mary I, Elizabeth I, of course Henry VIII, and we all know the rhyme, divorced we had died, divorced we had survived, his 6 wives. It's interesting to think about that all those things that are so kind of iconic and familiar in British history might not have happened had Henry IX ultimately become Henry IX.
Right. Well, even, thinking about now the current monarch, Elizabeth II, first of all, she comes from a line that may not even been in line to be
right.
the throne, because we talked about this a little bit before.
You had to do the cousin jump.
Yeah, but we also, maybe she's Elizabeth, but she's Elizabeth first, because again, there's no Elizabeth. The Elizabeth that we know and is such the powerful figure from English history is the result of the marriage to Anne Boleyn.
Yes.
And so if there's a surviving Henry IX, if there's, again, whether he chooses to remarry or not, maybe marries her, maybe doesn't, but there's no reason for those future offspring necessarily to assume the throne.
Right.
Again, this is to me, this is the wonderful thing about what we do here on A Fork in Time and talk about the ripples through history, is that the death of an infant, a couple of month-old infant, which was a very common thing in that time. I mean, this was not unheard of to have stillborn children, or have, the infant mortality rates are very, very, very high. It just so happens that when the mortality rate hits that particular infant in the circumstances that are there, the ripple is pretty dramatic.
That is a very big rock that gets dropped in that stream.
Right. Yeah. The pond has waves. It doesn't have ripples. The pond has waves. Which on that date, we'll assume February 22nd, because you like to assume that. But on that date, February 22nd, how many 2-month-olds died across England? More than one. More than one. It just so happens that it's that particular 2-month-old that is of particular importance, because it's the royal family and nobility and the heirs. And again, he didn't immediately, as we've talked about before, give up with Catherine. The other efforts were there, but...
And that, I think, shows, it goes to your point. Henry thought, this is a common occurrence. This has nothing to do with my wife. This is common infant mortality. It's a tragedy. It took my son, but it's not Catherine's fault. Yeah,
and you actually mentioned this before, part of what the drive was in the real timeline that led him to go through 6 wives and to seek a male heir, because they did favor that. That was the nature of how things passed. But the reason for doing that was he had not, as we talked about in a previous episode, he was not supposed to be king either.
Right.
He was the spare who becomes the heir and then assumes the throne. And so, that's part of what drove him there. So if you change the timeline of history with, again, the survival of just one child, the ripple effect is pretty dramatic. And again, personages that we know throughout history they may exist. There may have been a daughter. He may have eventually had a daughter, Elizabeth, but not the Elizabeth that we know, put into the circumstances that the Elizabeth that we know was put into, and the influence that has on history.
And most likely not by the same mother.
Correct. And so, again, it's this, as we talk about, the whole idea behind the Fork in Time is a small deflection, one small, the loss of an infant is not a small event, but the loss of that particular infant at that particular time, changes not only the course of the near-term history, but as we've talked about before, the ramifications in terms of the longer-term history, much more profound. So, anything else we ought to think about in terms of alternatives for Henry IX, Henry IX?
I think that pretty much covers it. I think it's important to note, Henry VIII is probably the reason we've never had a Henry IX. Henry VIII died in 1547. We're recording this in 2019, and we're still haven't gotten to Henry IX. And I think the subsequent things that ultimately happened because of this death, again, that's a very big stone that got dropped in that stream. I think the ultimate person that Henry VIII become, I think that might be one of the reasons why we haven't had a Henry IX.
I think that's probably true. So, Again, I want to thank Alexis for being able to join me again today. We do these as often as we can when we can be together to record.
Well, I live in Galveston, and it's this thing called summer. We get a little busy down there, so
Yeah.
I'm happy to be back.
Although we also intend in future episodes to do a little bit more of the virtual connection on this type of thing. We just find it a lot more fun, actually, to do the recordings in person. So we appreciate you joining us today. Hope that you've enjoyed another trip into our I'll call the English sector of A Fork in Time. Which
I promise we'll do other topics when I'm on the show, guys.
And she is versed to be able to do that. But today we thought this would be a good one, and also in some ways almost a companion topic to the one that we had covered, because there's multiple ways that you might have an altering of English history, either by Arthur living, so Henry never becomes king, or in this case his heir survives. They're similar, but as we've talked about today, they also are different.
The Tudors are a wealth of counterfactuals.
That's exactly right. And the influence of that particular time on history is what makes that counterfactual so interesting, because it influences not only the history of England, history of Europe, but ultimately the history of the New World, America, the United States, and everything that flows from that. So we hope you've enjoyed today our exploration down this alternative path of history, where at some point Prince Hal or Henry IX comes into being and we have a different course of events. As always, we're happy to have you join us for A Fork in Time. There's lots of different ways that you can help support the podcast, interact with us. As always, I would point out that we do have a website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The A on the front end, the podcast on the back end.
Don't forget those. They're important.
They're important. If you go there, you'll find lots of information. One of the things you'll find is obviously a way to listen online to the episodes, connectors to the various links for the podcatchers of your choice to be able to subscribe to the show or more easily access the show. Feedback forms, topic suggestion things that are there. You can become a member of the site, sign up for our newsletter so you're aware each time we have news to announce, and hope that you do so. If you're listening to this episode at about the time that it's being released, one of the things you'll find there is actually a survey that we've placed online. There's a link on the website to complete the listener survey. It's about 10 questions, won't take you more than a couple of minutes, but it can provide us some very valuable feedback, as we're still early on in the history of the podcast here. We're looking for that feedback to sort of find what is most appealing. We know what we like to talk about. That's great. We can talk about that without recording it and posting it and doing all kinds of things. So we're really looking to see what sort of tickles the ears and tickles the fancies of our listeners. And so that survey and others that we'll continue to have there in the future, as well as the feedback forms, are ways that you can provide us that particular way of getting back to us and helping us understand what's there. We have a blog. That's where we post each new episode as it becomes available. You can comment there. We've taken the forums down for now because we didn't have a lot of action on the forums, but we certainly welcome your comments on particular episodes. Certainly feel free to do that. You can also email us at aforkintimepodcast.com. And we want to hear back from you if you have different thoughts. Maybe we didn't think of something that's a very profound thing that would be a change, or maybe you disagree with our take. We want to get that as well. We're not just looking for attaboys and thumbs up. We're looking to engage and get some additional feedback there. So if you have some feedback on this or other episodes, leave the comments. Provide us the feedback. We'd like to hear back. If you're bold, maybe you want to send us an audio recording that we could actually play back and insert on a future episode. We can get you into the podcast that way and get your thoughts spread out to our listener group, because that's what we're looking to develop, is not just us communicating some ideas to a bunch of listeners, but to actually form a community that interacts and exchanges with each other. I will point out that there are other ways that you can support the podcast. One of those ways is actually, if where you get the podcast, be that Apple Podcast, iTunes, Google Play, many of those have the ability to do ratings for podcasts as well as leave reviews. Please do so. Certainly we'd like the constructive positive reviews, and 5-star ratings are always better than something else, but whatever you feel inclined to do there, that helps us to be noticed on those sites, get caught in the search engines, and just have more of an awareness about what's going on there. The last way that you can support is actually you can support us financially by becoming either a supporter or a patron of the podcast. There on the website, you'll find the link. I think it's on basically every page, because a lot of the stuff is on every page. Not that many pages on the website. But one of them is become a patron. Follow that link. It'll take you to our Patreon page and let you know what's there. We do have some perks for our supporters and patrons. Among those are each month we produce at least one exclusive episode which is only available to our supporters and patrons. We also give preferential topic suggestion treatment to our supporters and patrons. And for our patrons, we offer them the opportunity to be a guest host or to co-host on an episode, particularly for a topic that they've suggested. So we don't require that you support us financially. As I've said before, if we started a podcast to be in the business of making money, we made a very poor choice. But there are costs associated with producing, hosting, distributing the podcast that you can help us defer. Equipment costs so we can upgrade microphones and upgrade technologies, all the stuff that goes with that. So if you are inclined and are capable and want to support us financially, you can do that through the Patreon page. But the biggest support that you provide us is actually your time and your attention, and we are very appreciative of that. And we know that you can do a lot of other things, and you may be doing other things while you're listening to this podcast. I know as a listener, that's what I do as well.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, but I also know that it is an investment of your time, and someone's time and attention is, in my opinion, literally the most valuable thing that they can give, because once they give that, they can't use it for anything else or give it back. So supporting us through your listening and participation is greatly appreciated. And of course, you can always pass the word by word of mouth or on social media. I almost got in trouble because part of what Alexis does in her real life relates to social media, and I would be in a lot of trouble if I didn't mention that you can. We have our Facebook page, on Twitter, on Pinterest, the various places that we're represented. You can share posts there to make other folks aware of the podcast. Or by golly, you can have a conversation with a real life person and actually mention to them that you're aware of the podcast and think that they might enjoy it. So all those different ways that you can let us know you're out there. But we mainly do just want to hear from you so that we know what's going on, and then we know that these are not just words that are going out into the ether and we're not quite sure who's listening or what's happening there. We have heard back from listeners, so we know it's that there are folks that we don't even know that have found us, and that's one of the cool things about this, is knowing that people I may never meet I'm interacting with as well. So again, this is Don signing off on behalf of Alexis. Alexis, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to close this as we've closed many podcasts in the past by borrowing words from a good friend of mine, which are sort of twisted and adapted from words of baseball great Yogi Berra, which is reminding you that if you happen upon a fork in time, take it.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.